and they'll end every sentence with it's random kind of sounds. And you can see it if you watch Pokemon, exactly like that.
Well, what I was wondering is, like, I personally, like, I don't really mind if you make an idiomatic translation of something, but I mean, I would rather have, personally, a natural line reading than, like, perfect synchronization of the lips. And I think that, like, most voice directors fall on the other side of that decision.
I agree, there's a lot of bad dubbing out there. And the trick, there are many tricks, but one of them is to match the beginning and the end of the line and not sweat the middle, because the eye really picks up on endings and beginnings. If someone goes like this, hey, how you doing? And they start talking after they've moved their lips, it's very bizarre to the eye, and you catch that immediately. And if they go over the end, and as long as you match the sounds at the beginning and the end, and you end at the right times, you can get away with a lot in the middle. And I think that's one trick to use for better dubbing.
So where do you place your priorities about that then? I mean,
the best line possible is the highest priority. And then if you nail the sync and you spend a long time trying to nail the sync, then it's great. But if you have to sacrifice a little sync, or faking words over closed mouths, we do a lot, because to avoid pauses.
Or long speeches when people are walking away from the camera.
Yeah. Exactly. There's a lot of ways you can avoid what you're talking about, and it is a real problem. There's a lot of very badly done document. It's a shame.
Thanks.
Hi. First, before I ask my question, I'd like to thank you for your translation of Tactics Ogre. Having played the original with a text file translation of it, it's like night and day. Beyond that, my question actually goes to, you were saying one of the things you try to do is write the best English line possible. What happens when you encounter a poorly written original? You want to take that one?
Sure. To the extent possible, we strip. If there's actual information there that needs to get across to the player, obviously, usually we'll. I won't even say 100% of the time. We'll keep it. Well, if it's obviously it's key information, it stays. But as far as the trappings of it, we'll take liberties with it to make it what we think is good, and I think that's the value that we bring to the table. Honestly, a straight literal translation is much easier to do, and hopefully, more times than not, when we do make those departures, we're making an improvement there, and that's going to be relative, subject to the viewer, the player's opinion. But we're not afraid to step away from the Japanese when we think it's going to improve the final product.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, I read like a couple of pages here now and a couple of the working designs translation stuff, and I'm just wondering, like, are you ever in a situation where you actually have to like change the source code in the game, like for help with localization, like they've done for some of their stuff? They did it, like they just talk about how they would like change some controls so that it's more intuitive and things like that. Have you ever had to do stuff like that?
There's a little bit of stuff that goes on, but it's done in very close connection with the developers.
Yeah, we personally have never done that.
Yeah,
we're not programmers.
You wouldn't do that, too. That would be stepping out of bounds.
Rather like short so one, any chance Landriser will ever actually come back to the US?
Any chance who or what?
Landriser?
Oh, I have no idea. Sorry.
The second thing is, you sign my copy of Texas.
Sure. We'll stick around. We won't run away afterwards. Even if they kick us out the door, we'll hang outside for you.
Hey guys, I want to apologize first. Every question I was thinking of asking was answered beforehand, so there's like a fifth string. But
we've run out of answers too. So.
Have you ever had an issue where you were not the translators on a sequel in a long-running series and had to adapt to a previous translation? I'm trying to bring up because you mentioned Nintendo's internal translation house, and I had read that some later Fire Emblem games were outsourced, and there was a bit of an issue.
I had to do that on 10.2, and it was a nightmare, let me tell you.
Yeah, because the jerk who translated 10 was fantastic.
Sequels?
I've I've been in the position where something I did then went on to have a sequel that was translated by somebody else.
With the Phoenix, right?
The Phoenix, right? Yeah, I did 1, and then I came back and did 4.
Right, I saw your comments as well.
And you do have to, when I came back and did 4, I did have to go through 2 and 3 and to make sure that things were consistent. So you do a little bit of work in that regard. Style-wise, I'm not really too afraid of changing things up a little bit, especially if it works within the context of the game. I've certainly been changing the character talk if they had established that. I mean, there are certain holy cows that you don't want to get rid of because it would take the gamer out of, the person who's waited for that sequel would be disappointed. So, yeah, I mean, it's another consideration. You do have to please a lot of people, and you oftentimes can't please everybody. But that is one of the things you take into account.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I know I'm probably going to touch on a gray area of translation here in this question, but and it's also like a dying thing with changing audio to CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays. But as a professional, what is your take on fan translations of games that was popular 10, 15 years ago?
My own take on fan translations. If it's something that's not out yet, and you're trying to get, there's certainly no harm to it at all. I mean, I think, it's...
Yeah, especially if the game isn't out.
And you're just trying to help other people play it, or, you're doing it for your own, edification and fun. That's kind of how the tactics, or the Lions translation. So I had some downtime, I swear. I just started translating that game. In the hopes that they would remake it or something. I'm not even kidding. And luckily got to, it's not like we took that and just dumped it in. But, I think it can be a lot of fun.
Anything that gets the community talking about translation or thinking about translation is a good thing in my mind. I don't want to take any money away from the developers. That's where it would cross the line for me. But
sure.
Definitely, I applaud their efforts, and I really wish I had their time. Because, man, it's a lot of work. So, yeah, no, it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I also just want to, I feel like pain about the old school translation because I have done it myself.
It's rough, and it's unfortunately, just because it's old school doesn't mean it doesn't still happen. So,
yeah. Let's go with some other stuff.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Did you come up with a new one?
I did. I had about 6, and pretty much all of it whittled down, but I do have one half question I'd love to ask you. And again, thank you so much for all the work you've done. Your work in particular has really sort of just opened my eyes to both the challenges and the beauty of localization.
Great. Well, definitely our pleasure, and we're glad there are people out there that appreciate it.
So, my minor question is, you mentioned in the Ace Attorney series, Capcom was very insistent on how you name the characters. Are you familiar with the Apollo Justice David Gett conspiracy theory?
The Apollo, sorry? No. Is the answer, but what is this?
There's this fan conspiracy theory, which has frightening merits in some ways, which is David Gett is styled on the Greek god Zeus, and Apollo was obviously named after Apollo. They share many physical traits, and it's an odd choice in a series where characters who were related had very many similar traits that Capcom requested. It's interesting that it was not, the link was not in the Japanese version, but in the English version, Capcom may have specifically requested that Apollo Justice be given the name Apollo Justice.
Apollo Justice had about 10 first names and 10 last names for that main character, and which I provided. And then they matched them together, and I sort of had veto power if they picked the bad ones. And they came up with Apollo Justice, and I was like, give me a break. But, and then, after you say it 10 times, it actually starts sounding okay. And it was great. It was a good Apollo. I will blow the conspiracy theory out of the water, though.
You don't think they're related then?
It was random.
All right.
It's random habits.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Earlier in the presentation, you spoke about progress in localization for the last decade.
could be done well. I would like to think ADR would go away. If you could get either the money to hand animate everything to the English or a technological solution that could do that well enough, I would imagine that would be going.
Yeah, and they have done that with varying degrees of success in some games where they'll automate lip movements and that sort of thing. And certainly anything that reduces the restrictions to the process is helpful because it opens up opportunities. And you do have to make a lot of compromises when you're translating something. You're going to, if you want to keep the humor, you're going to lose the style. And if you want to keep all the content, you're going to lose some of the flow. And so you're always making compromises, and the more choices you have, the better choices you can make.
So, you guys did a great job with FF12 Story, obviously. I assume you guys worked on Final Fantasy Tactics, the original one.
The original Final Fantasy Tactics?
Yes.
No, we had nothing to do with that. Really? Really? Are you asking that much?
Okay.
We are talking about the 1997
Yes.
PlayStation 1. No, we had nothing to do with that.
Okay.
I joined Square in 98.
And I joined Square in 2003.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So that was after.
That was in grads.
So you worked on Vegas Story.
Valiant's rules.
I worked on Vagrant Story. It was actually the first game that I did by myself at Square.
Okay, but then you redid Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions later.
War of the Lions I worked on with Tom Slattery. It was right around when 12 was finishing up, so it would have been around 2006.
Okay, good. Because I don't know how that's what it is.
Oh, it's something from just that era where it was probably deadlines were part of it. I know that there were 3 translators on that, and apparently they had no contact with each other whatsoever. Well, there are names that appear in 3 or 4 different spellings throughout the game. I'm not, saying that to be mean. It's just I think clearly that the time constraints on that must have been horrendous. And it's another game where there's like 500,000 characters of Japanese text. So, I think that they probably did an amazing job considering the constraints that they had to work under. I'm sure that, I know that, another thing I know for sure is that the Japanese development team was not involved at all. So getting things like line length limits, to have more space and, changing fonts were not things that they would have had access to. And so all of those things are going to impact negatively on the localization.
So you had a good time retranslating it then?
Yeah, that's something where that was a little tighter, and I was really only working mainly on the main event scenes with Tom, and then Tom was doing that and a lot of everything else. More time would have been great, even for us. But yes, it was a joy to retranslate because it's a wonderful game and it's really well written. It's just fantastic. Thanks, sir.
Two quick questions. Are there any differences when you guys work on a console game versus a portable game? And then also, what are you guys working on?
The first question, sometimes, it depends on the limitations of the game. There's things you can do, things as simple as text limits, especially when you get into menus and stuff like that. When you're working on a console game, the sky's the limit in a lot of cases, and especially working with a flexible team, they will actually shift around the way that the menu looks or works to accommodate the longer line lengths in English. And you often don't have that kind of leeway with a handheld game, although with the higher resolutions these days, it's less and less of a burden, really. And for the second thing, we're on NDA for just about everything. So
We can mention that we're working on the Eco novelization.
Oh, that's right. The game Eco was written, was novelized by a Japanese author when the first edition of the game came out, and we're working on the translation of that novel in English to roughly coincide with the re-release of the HD version.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Hi, thanks. So, with localization in general, I noticed a lot that it's kind of a rise of American video game storytelling and like maybe French video game storytelling and things like that. I have no idea how it goes over there, but I noticed that maybe American games don't sell quite as well in Japan. Do you think some of that is localization based? Like, we love Mass Effect 1, Mass Effect 2, but how does that translate to them? Do you have any experience of all talking to people over there? Or do you think maybe it's not, I don't know about Mass Effect selling well, but I know like the Xbox doesn't sell as well over in Japan and things like that.
I think that for the average gamer, and I can't really speak as much about the localization, although sometimes like the developers will tell us like horror stories about when they've played in Japanese. But I think a lot of it is really the style of games. Like Mass Effect, I think, is perceived as like a first-person shooter, and those are just notoriously unpopular there. Well, it's obviously not a first-person shooter, but there are those elements there. You know, as a role-playing game, it's not Final Fantasy. And interestingly, a lot of the developers that we talked to, like the Minagawa-sans and the Matsunos, I mean, they speak very highly of those kind of. They love that stuff. Probably this team in particular, but. I think that they're out there looking for new experiences a lot more than maybe the average Japanese gamer who's just looking forward to the next Dragon Quest. And I think that's a lot of it.
Yeah, a large chunk of the Japanese gaming population is an older gaming population, and they're in their 40s, and they're looking for sort of downtime, and they're not really hardcore gamers, so they want to do the kind of games that they used to enjoy. So they're very happy with games like Dragon Quest that follow that same formula, and that's great for that market. And maybe not as adventurous as the US gamers might be, or as new kinds of storytelling styles, play styles.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm kind of a hobbyist translator, and I run into this a lot, and it just kind of kills me every time. When you run into the word kami, God or gods?
It depends on the game world.
Yeah.
Is it a monotheistic culture? We actually had to ask for Tactics Ogre Lows Come Together.
And for 12, I think we asked.
Oh yeah, and for 12 too, because it wasn't clear.
When we can ask, we will. Because yeah, it does depend on the game. It does depend on what the history of that game is supposed to be. I know one thing we try to avoid religiously is saying things like "oh God" or that kind of expression, just throwing that in because
that's a pet peeve of
culturally
mine.
wrong.
Yeah, and even saying "thank God," "oh my God," "Jesus," "yeesh," I actually avoid because it's a mutation. I avoid all those because it feels very, very Western to me, and that's not appropriate.
Hi. Another question regarding the Ace Attorney game one more time. You mentioned you had sent the names that you've come up with to the original developers. So you had, did you have like one big session just to collect all the names? And if so, how much fun were those sessions to come up with those names?
Well, especially on one, which is where most of the naming stuff went on, and I was working through an agency, it was literally me sitting in Starbucks thinking up random names, and some of them have very specific requirements, like a guy named Larry Butts had to have a name that could be mispronounced to make several different kinds of jokes. And so all of the names for all of the options for his name there was only 3 or 4 that worked, but I had to come up with a name that could work in several different combinations. So I certainly had fun with it. And it was difficult because I then sent all that to Capcom, and they would sometimes not make the choices. In fact, none of the Phoenix Wright and Apollo Justice, neither of those were my top choices at all. And they chose them, and I'm like, okay. And by the end of the game, I was like, yeah, that guy's great. I love Phoenix Wright. I knew that guy. It's, the best kind of collaboration is when you're sitting around a table joking and coming up with stuff, and that's great. It wasn't the experience on those games in particular.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello again.
Hi.